So we have two very different dances this morning. An adult, King David, dancing with at least 30,000 other people in God's praise, and Salome, a young girl conscripted by both her mother and her father, or stepfather, we don't know, to perform solo for others with tragic consequences for everyone, but especially for John the Baptist. So let's go back to the first one. When I let Shannon know what this first reading was, she texted me a YouTube link of Mick Jagger and David Bowie. They're dancing in the street, song called Dancing in the Street. It's a great golden oldie that will get you dancing in your living room and, enjoying the 80s style again. So this is the first recommendation of the morning. Find it on YouTube sometime this week and bounce along with Mick and David. I have always been drawn to this story of King David dancing in the streets with such excess and unabashed joy. He has just united the north and the south into one, Israel and Judah, into one united kingdom, and assumed the throne over this united kingdom. He's bringing the ark of God, the ark of the presence of the Lord, into this newly established capital of Jerusalem at the head of a massive parade, 30,000 or more people dressed in a priest's undergarment vest and nothing else. But not only is he dancing, he also feeds the people. He's beginning this dynastic rule in the way of a good king by worshiping God and caring for the people. So in all the rest of the story that follows, which, spoiler alert, is not very pretty, I don't want us to lose sight of this. Joy in God's presence, joy that permeates the body and the mind and the spirit and all of the senses, Joy along with practical compassion towards others. David loves God and his neighbor. He is being a good king. But David is also human. David is human, very human. And so there is a shadow side as well. And David's dark side has to do mostly with the relationships closest to him, his home life, and his treatment of women. And if we were to continue just a few passages beyond where Shannon read, we would see that shadow on full display. So let's dig in. This parade is very loud and very bloody. We don't get some of the details in our reading, but bulls, ox, and young calves, so bulls and calves are being sacrificed every 6 paces that this parade moves forward. Can you imagine? Blood is flowing in the streets, and it's ear-splittingly loud. The bulls are bellowing, the calves are crying, the trumpets are blaring, there's lyres and castanets and tambourines and drums, and 30,000, at least 30,000, that's the men. That's just the men, because that's all that counted, right? Sorry. Shouting. This is full-out, ecstatic, religious festival. It's also a masterpiece of political theater. David is leaving no doubt that he is the head of this new nation that the house of Saul has lost. He is establishing this new capital as the center of religious and political power and cementing his place in history. But while he is caught up in this massive ecstatic celebration, Michal, his wife and Saul's daughter, is disgusted. The scripture says she loses respect for David. The blood, the fervor, the nakedness, all of it. It brings to a head the terrible treatment that she has received for years by both her father and her husband. And it is very, very rare. It is exceedingly rare to hear biblical women speaking out negatively about much of anything. But Michal does. And in this passage, just beyond where Shannon read, the scriptures record this fraught exchange. David went home, okay, after all of this public, compassion and celebration, he went home to bless his household. But Saul's daughter, Michal, came out to meet him. How did Israel's king honor himself today, she said? By exposing himself in plain view of the female servants like any indecent person would. And David replies, I was celebrating before the Lord, who chose me over your father and his entire family, okay? Like you. And who appointed me leader over the Lord's people, over Israel, and I will celebrate before the Lord again. And then the very next verse, verse 23, Michal, Saul's daughter, had no children to the day she died, meaning this estrangement between her and David was permanent. Now, I have always interpreted Michal as a nag and a killjoy. Instead of joining in the dancing and welcoming her husband home, she has always sounded to me like kind of like a cold fish who couldn't handle exuberance and the vulnerability of passionate joy. But this time around, I was drawn to find out more about her. Who was she? And why did she pour cold water on David's magnanimous generosity and joy? Maybe, just maybe, things were not as they first seem. Maybe I was mistaken in my judgment of her. The truth is, have you ever had that happen to you? You were mistaken in your judgment? The truth is that it can happen that our interpretation of people and events is simply not the case. When Gretchen came to pick up her chicken barbecue yesterday, she was wearing a shirt that said, "Don't believe everything you think." I wanted to buy a lot of them, wear them myself, and hand them out. In fact, if you frequently find yourself thinking that you know what's happening, you could tattoo on the inside of your trigger finger, "You might be wrong." And seeing that might make you think twice before pulling the trigger of your bad judgment of someone else, when in fact, you don't know the full story. I, for instance, have held judgment in my heart towards people who will not get vaccinated or who will not wear masks. But this week, I have had conversations with several people from different racial and economic backgrounds who hold this anti-vax, anti-mask position. And I have listened with an open mind and an open heart. And it has been hard, and I have not changed my thinking, but I do understand more, and I certainly judge less. So long and short, I was wrong on Michal. This time around, as I dug deeper and I listened with much greater curiosity and compassion, I ended up feeling so much for her. And I am so glad that I know her better. The first thing that I didn't know was that Michal, how much she truly loved David. She is the only woman, get this, she's the only woman in the Bible who is recorded as loving a man. Initiating. In all other places, well, anyway, you get it. But Michal does. She loves him. And she asks her father to be married to him. Now, Saul needs to neutralize David's growing popularity and his growing power that threaten Saul. And so a marriage to his daughter would be very politically expedient. So he gives Michal to David. But in Saul's eyes and in David's eyes, she is simply a political pawn. Neither of them treat her as anything else. She is called throughout this whole story, she is called Saul's daughter, even after she is David's wife. But again, she loves him, and she risks her father's terrible wrath to spring him out of the prison, the palace prison into which he has landed, and helps him escape. Whereupon he heads to the hills, right? And then we hear all of that there's a wonderful, there's packed with good stories, but he heads to the hills, and she doesn't see him again for years and years and years. Even though he's in communication with her brother Jonathan, who also loves him, loves David, even though he could have easily gotten word to Michal, easily sent for her, easily thanked her for saving him, he never does. He marries at least 2 other women and fathers many children while Michal languishes. And Saul, perhaps to disentangle himself from familial responsibility to David, who knows why, but he gives Michal to another man, Paltiel, who actually appears to love her, to treasure her, who treats her well, who doesn't use her, doesn't play off her royal status and her wealth. And so Paltiel is utterly devastated when David finally, years later, sends his men to retrieve Michal and bring him back to him. But why? Why years later does he go after her? Well, Saul and Jonathan have both died in battle. And after their deaths, David moves quickly to unite the north and the south into this one kingdom. But Saul has other sons, right? And while David is highly popular, before he can assume the king, as king, legitimate heir to Saul's throne, so he does that through Michal. Michal is once again useful to him. It doesn't really matter that she is happily married. It doesn't matter at all, actually, that she is happily married, that she is settled into a home where she is cherished and treasured. Doesn't matter in the slightest. She is now useful again. Now, possibly Michal still harbors a love for David. Possibly she is hopeful that this time around he will love her or at least respect her. But when she sees this parade, when she sees him bringing his entourage of women and children and serving women at the head of this massive parade and cavorting in basically his altogether in the streets, it just brings to a head the utter lack of respect or any sense of gratitude, despite her having risked everything for him. And she speaks out about it. And for doing so, she is exiled into some far corner of the palace, and we do not hear from her or see her again. Now her reign on his parade makes a whole lot more sense, and I am deeply sympathetic to her. I'm not telling you this story to diss David. He is human, and he is anointed by God to lead God's people, and he tries to do God's will. This collective outpouring of absolute joy as the Ark of the Covenant, the symbol of God's presence among them, is led into a new capital of a newly united people. This collective exhale of celebration, it's utterly authentic, and it's real. Caring for the people by feeding them, that is real. Even if there are mixed motives, because of course people are going to like a ruler who feeds them, right? Gives them meat and bread. Utterly real, and he is trying to do God's will, but he is also pretty lacking in humility, or emotional intelligence, as we would say. Pretty lacking in gratitude towards someone through whom God has worked to make it possible for him to be King David rather than a dead son-in-law. Michal will be the first of many women who will suffer because of this poverty of imagination and empathy in David's soul. I love Bible stories, if you can tell. We are human just like David, just like Michal. We are human. We also toggle between right praise of God and right treatment of others, and idolatrous worship of other things, and using others, to further our own ends. The good news is that God continues, just like God continues to work with us and in us and through us, just as God continued to work in David's life throughout his many years, both blessing him and challenging him to grow up into greater maturity of faith. And like I said, emotional intelligence, and I don't know how far he ever got with that one, but for sure, God never gave up on him, just like God never gives up on us. So what can we take from all of this? Number one, joy, okay? Joy. When you see this week, when you see or hear or smell or touch or taste something beautiful or delicious or just, good, let joy bubble up in you. Even tiny bubbles of it, that's the Spirit at work in you. Don't dampen it. Let it have room to breathe and move and dance and, get you up and going. And tattoo your trigger finger. You might be wrong. Listen to others and yourself with real curiosity for the rest of the story, the part that's not immediately apparent. This will bring you, first of all, it will improve your relationships, but it will also bring you closer into the presence of God simply by moving you closer to a compassionate heart. So next week, we're going to hear a passage from David's life that would be hard to overstate how important it is for both Jews and Christians. But for this week, you've got your homework. Get your dance shoes out and listen with curiosity and compassion until you can really hear the rest of the story. Thanks be to God. Amen.